All right, this panel is so popular, we have other panelists wanting to join us. It's amazing. So my name is Michael Atkinson, and I'll be moderating this panel. I'm a partner at Kroll & Mooring in Washington, D.C. I also teach a law school class at George Washington University on AI law and policy. So I'm thrilled to be here this morning, in part because Dawn and her people prepared my class plan, including my questions. I don't have to worry about awkward moments where students don't answer my questions because I have these wonderful panelists who are going to answer all of my questions. And best news for all of us, there's no final exam for you to take or for me to grade. So I also welcome questions during the panel. So no pride as a moderator. If you have a question while we're going through this, please raise your hand and ask a question. So my background in AI began in 2018 when I was became the Inspector General of the U.S. intelligence community. And I realized I had become responsible for all of the AI weapons systems and programs and projects that were being developed, procured, and deployed by the intelligence community, all of the then 17, now 18 intelligence community elements. And what I realized was that the U.S. intelligence community was correctly spending hundreds of millions of dollars on AI programs and a very, very small amount on oversight of those programs. And so I wrote a public sort of notice giving sort of my thoughts on what I called an accountability gap between the rollout of AI programs and systems and the governance, and how the systems were really outpacing the governance and oversight of the programs, calling that an accountability gap. And if we fast forward to today, that accountability gap still persists. It's closing, thankfully, but it still persists as the rollout of AI just continues to outpace the governance. And so what we're going to talk about today, ethics in AI law and ethics in autonomous systems. Autonomous systems on the ground, in the air, at sea, and in orbit increasingly depend on AI for perception, prediction, and decision support, which raises hard questions about responsibility when the machine makes the wrong call. At the same time, the mix of regulations shaping responsible AI are shifting toward AI-specific legal frameworks. Think the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, or think the executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy AI. And also, the defense communities worldwide are debating lethal autonomous weapons, human control, and accountability in conflict. So this morning, we've got a very ambitious agenda, but we're going to examine how AI is being used in autonomous and uncrewed systems for defense and commercial missions, explore the really hot issues on AI policy and developing responsible AI, think transparency, explainability, algorithmic accountability, and safety. We're going to talk about how organizations are formalizing responsible AI and mitigating risks from unaccountable AI or responsibility gaps, and time permitting, dig into liability, insurance, and risk allocation when AI tools go wrong. So I'll ask each of the panelists for a brief introduction, who you are, what you do, and one sentence on where AI law and ethics shows up in your daily work. So Will, let's start with you. Would you introduce yourself, Victus Technologies, and share one example of how AI-enabled autonomy is changing how your customer designs or operate systems?
Thank you. Will Tebow. I'm not a lawyer, to make that clear, but
you can still sit here.
Right. If anyone needed an extra chair. I was in the Army at one point. Worked at tech companies like Palantir, the Pentagon's AI office, the CDAO, a drone company called Vector, of which I was the first employee, and then have started working at Victus, a software provider that builds inertia-based navigation for contested environments. And AI appears in our line of work because we're trying to build the software layer that can help define systems' current location, where they're going, and how to communicate that information to a user autonomously. And that is, I think, the crux of where ethics interplay into especially the military and defense applications of artificial intelligence, as opposed to the end of the shot or the operation.
That makes sense. Matt, I know as my law partner that you've been tracking disinformation, national security, and emerging tech for years. How does AI and autonomous systems interact with information operations, national security risk, and oversight, all in one or two
Well,
sentences.
yeah, that's right. Hi, everyone. Really wonderful to be with you all. As Michael said, I'm Matt Ferrara. I'm a partner at Kroll and Mooring. I've spent like half my career in public service and half in private law. Most recently, I was at the Department of Homeland Security in the Biden administration, where I was a senior counselor for cyber and emerging tech to the secretary. And then with the change of administrations, I came out as one often does in these circumstances, and I got to join Michael in the partnership. So, and I always just say, just as a prefatory comment, where do I see AI and ethics coming up in my daily work? I think we spend a lot of time counseling government contractors and selling autonomy to the government in a contested regulatory environment where it's not entirely clear what the rules are, what lawful use means, what appropriate levels of human oversight are, is a very interesting and ever-changing fact pattern. To answer your question, our scripted question, I'll say that you have to think of it in two ways, particularly when it comes to disinformation. One is kinetic, the other is non-kinetic. So kinetic, I think we'll really talk a bit more about, like the actual dropping of bombs and shooting of missiles. Non-kinetic AI, when you think of information operations, AI is really a force multiplier. So it could just create disinformation at volume, and it can be very targeted. So I think one way to think about it is when it's disinformation targeted at one person from a supposedly trusted source in the military context, that might be you think that you're receiving a message from your commander ordering you to attack, if we were still in Afghanistan, a caravan of Al Qaeda, and it turns out it was an actual wedding party, and that leads to great, ramifications both politically and militarily. Sort of targeted disinformation, and then there's a broadcast disinformation, so it just sort of goes out to everyone. And a potential for that would be a PRC invasion of Taiwan, where the Taiwanese president comes on television apparently and tells the citizenry to put down their arms and surrender. Right, that would be kind of like a form of disinformation that is amplified by AI, because of course the media would be much more believable, but also you could imagine ways in which it targets the individual receiving the information with greater accuracy. So yeah, it's scary times.
No, totally. It's a nice topic at 9:30 in the morning, especially. Todd, welcome. And from your law firm's vantage point, let's hear what kinds of AI-related issues you're seeing in robotics, autonomous vehicles, drones, and industrial systems and the like.
Hey, everybody. My name's over there, too. My name is Todd Basil. I'm a partner at Greenberg Traurig. I lead our robotics and autonomous technologies group. And pretty much every day I'm working with some sort of robot, whether it drives, swims, flies, or what have you. I have a special affinity for the ones that fly because I was formerly an engineer at Bell Helicopter. So you are my people. This is my happy place. Will, I gotta say, you are a brave man being on a stage with 5 lawyers. The skies are clear right now, but if a lightning bolt hits, this is where it's gonna happen, and you're gonna be collateral damage. So apologies in advance.
He's already been inundated with business cards. That's what's hit him so far.
As far as what we see on the AI front, the ethics stuff comes into it a good bit. I'll be honest with you, most of the questions I get on that front are on the regulatory side of things. And most often in terms of, hey, what data can I use? How can I use it? How can I not use it? And what are the problems going to be if I, kind of step out of line on those sorts of things? So kind of a different perspective, a little more regulatory, a little more IP focused, but that is my practice. I'm a tech transactions attorney at heart. So I do deals that involve data and technology, and that's how it kind of ropes in.
Yeah. Katie, so let's talk about you. I know you focus on technology, transaction, regulatory risk. Can you talk to us briefly about how AI ethics, transparency, and allocation responsibility show up in your client work?
Oh, sure. Thank you. And by way of background, I'm Katie Inman, partner at Holland and Knight. Before joining the firm, I was general counsel for Attorney General Ashley Moody of Florida, now Senator Moody. During my time there, around the 2022-2023 timeframe, I was the first GC that she had who rolled out an AI policy for the Office of the Attorney General, because I knew that this would be a need to address it. That was back when we were seeing, and maybe we still are, a lot of fake cases come up, citations that lawyers hear about and get sanctioned for. But before that, I was at FAA for many years, mainly in regulatory work in the Office of the Chief Counsel. Held a few different roles in that capacity, also detailed over into the air traffic front office, which was a lot of fun. Before that, I was spent about a dozen years at NTSB, writing a couple hundred aviation enforcement opinions. So got to know Part 91 very well as other regulated entities parts. And as far as coming up in my practice on a daily basis, I would say, I work with a lot of companies that are new or, very enterprising, really ambitious, really great ideas. And they're not used to a tightly regulated environment like the FAA or aviation. So navigating that space is actually pretty challenging, but a lot of fun.
Yeah, great. So Mark, let's hear about you. You've long worked at the intersection of aviation regulation and emerging tech. How's AI changing your conversations about certification, operational approvals, enforcement, and the like?
Yeah, so I'm a partner at Fox Rothschild. I've been practicing aviation law exclusively for 36 years now. It's an industry practice. We do anything that touches on aviation. Our clients are airlines, charter operators, drone operators, certificated drone delivery operators, fixed base operators, airports, repair stations, basically anything touching on aviation. And it's funny because the AI issues in both manned and unmanned aircraft are the same, but the conversations and the outcomes are dramatically different. Because obviously, for manned aviation, the goal is one accident or incident every 10 million hours, and obviously nobody expects drones to meet that requirement these days, particularly small UAS. That's because the risks are lower. So as a result, you're in a situation where the unmanned aircraft can move much faster towards the idea of having one person who may not even be a pilot, who's in a position monitoring highly automated systems, with the idea that he's not supposed to intervene and let them go unless something happens. But in the manned community, there's a huge amount of skepticism to allowing, anything that's, not really well understood into the cockpit or touching on aviation systems.
Yeah, that makes sense, particularly where we are today with sort of some of the systems and the oversight. And speaking of oversight, let's talk about the policy landscape as it exists today. So on the civilian side, the European Union has adopted the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, which is a risk-based framework that classifies certain AI use as high risk. So for this audience, think AI systems deployed on or in connection with autonomous vehicles affecting driving and safety-related components of critical infrastructure, and some law enforcement tools. While the EU AI Act excludes from its oversight systems used exclusively for military defense or national security purposes. In the US, I mentioned the executive order. It's 14110 on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence that directs agencies to issue guidance, adopt framework like the NIST risk management framework, and address AI's impact on critical infrastructure and the like. On the military side, we're seeing lethal autonomous weapon systems, also position, navigation, and timing, AI-enabled targeting, swarming, global navigation satellite systems are all advancing an impact on international humanitarian law principles like distinction and proportionality. So Todd, I mentioned the executive order. Could you walk us through the key elements of that executive order that matter for companies building or deploying AI in autonomous systems?
Sure, just put me right on the spot here. I'll be honest with you. I thought 14110 was rescinded by Trump hours into the administration, right? So I think that one came out under the Biden administration. It obviously had several policy goals. I think if I can maybe turn that one on its head and talk about where it's gone since, as you would imagine, it's the EOs that have come out that affect AI under the current administration are very on brand for the current administration. It's seeking to deregulate by regulating in terms of pulling everything up to the federal level and clearing barriers. The idea is take all the shackles off, unleash drone dominance, unleash AI dominance, and also spread that out to the world, right? If we take kind of a Cold War sort of scenario, one of the EOs is promoting the export of our tech stack. In some cases, you're like, hey, wait, why are we trying to share our technology? Aren't we in a race with China? Aren't we in a race with whoever? But I think, part of that is to get it out there with our friends, get them hooked on our stuff, so that they don't go and get the other guy's stuff. So, we're seeing a lot of things in that respect. Promoting data center, permitting, federal law framework, all that sort of stuff. So it's quite the 180 from what we were seeing under the Biden administration.
Yeah. And so, Katie, following up on that, from a transactional and compliance perspective, how is the executive order and the other executive orders that have followed on, particularly with the new administration and following guidance, how's that changing how you structure contracts or advise on policies, for example, around model evaluation, documentation of training data, or obligations to disclose AI, particularly in safety, critical components?
Yes, great question. Thank you. I think for the most part, the general principles that pervade contract law are still fundamental and can be applied in any context. Allocating responsibility, how you protect your intellectual property, obviously, liability provisions, who's responsible for what and how, and how do you anticipate what the risks are and how do you address those? So I think with that just general bedrock that we're working from, I think taking a page from the regulator's playbook is really the smartest way to do it. Thinking like the regulator, for example, FAA has a safety assurance policy specifically on AI. Why not use that? If you're a regulated entity, take a page from their playbook, look at what they expect, look at their internal guidance. What do they expect from their own inspectors when it comes to AI and reviewing what different folks are doing in the regulated space? So I don't think we're starting from scratch here. I think we've got a lot of good fundamental principles to work from. And I would say using those as they converge with the newer types of policies is the way to go, rather than focusing on something kind of broad and amorphous, like an executive order that comes out at the top level.
Yes, that makes sense, particularly if anybody's ever seen how these executive orders come together with all the different equities with the agencies and departments trying to reach consensus on what they can all actually agree on and go public with. Let's cross the pond, if you will, and talk about the EU AI Act. And Mark, I talked briefly about the EU AI Act, and it does define AI broadly. It also, imposes some pretty stringent obligations on high-risk systems while explicitly excluding uses for national security purposes, particularly in the military and defense space. How should U.S. International companies building autonomous or uncrewed systems think about whether they're in the EU AI scope, the EU AI Act scope, and what compliance will entail?
Well, for the most part, again, this is everything is territorial, so it depends. If you're building a system or a product or a drone that's going to be used in the EU, you have to meet EU standards. If you're going to operate in the EU, you have to meet the EU standards. If you're operating solely in the United States and the system isn't collecting data and being used globally, then the EU rules aren't going to apply. Really, the drone industry is kind of suffering from the early decision not to have uniform agreements on unmanned system standards at the beginning, because we don't really have that problem in manned aviation. The U.S. has multilateral treaties with almost everyone. Aircraft certification is done on a bilateral basis. The EU and the U.S. are working together for a joint standard on having AI certified in manned aircraft, because that's all done by treaty. But there's nothing like that in the unmanned space. So as a result, when we're talking about unmanned aircraft, every country seems very comfortable in just forging ahead in their own direction and just let the chips fall where they may, and not working on trying to harmonize these standards. So I think that's really, it's all coming back to haunt the unmanned industry, this lack of multilateral action at the early stages of setting these standards.
And do you see U.S. companies trying to adjust to that, or is this more falling on the international companies?
It's primarily the international companies. It's the U.S. companies are basically focused on trying to cope with the idea, because the Trump administration obviously is trying even harder to separate the U.S. from the EU markets with things like the FCC covered lists and things like that. So they're just trying to cope with those issues and not worry, too much about the other part of it.
Right. They've got enough to worry about right now. So let's pivot from the frameworks to the hardest edge of this debate, the military and security applications of AI in autonomous systems. The group Autonomy Global has an article out called When Autonomy Takes Aim, and it traces how positioning, navigation, and timing form the backbone of lethal autonomous weapon systems, and how conflicts like Ukraine illustrate the rapid evolution of cheap drones, AI-enabled targeting, and swarming at scale. We've seen this evolution on the battlefield with ground robots just in the last month. Ground robots used to provide mainly support roles. Recently, however, we're seeing ground robots move into combat roles. Last month, for example, Ukrainian President Zelensky posted a message on social media suggesting that Ukraine had captured a Russian position, including Russian soldiers, using only ground robots and aerial drones. The first time it seems like that soldiers have surrendered to robots on the battlefield. And Autonomy Global's report has noted that, as they say, academic and policy literature on laws or lethal autonomous weapon systems emphasize that when machines select and engage targets with less direct human oversight, long-standing international humanitarian law principles, think distinction, proportionality, and precaution, become harder to apply and accountability gaps widen. That's what they say. And there's that phrase again, accountability gaps, that I mentioned at the beginning, where performance is really, the amount of money spent on performance is just greatly exceeding the amount of money spent on oversight. And we're seeing this here today. Here in the US, the Pentagon announced recently an intention to create a new subunified command for autonomous drone warfare and to request around $54 billion for fiscal 2027 for the defense, what's called the Defense Autonomous Warfare Group. That group, its funding had previously been at only about $220 million. So think about scaling in 1 year, if this actually gets passed and implemented, from $220 million to $54 billion. I don't know if there's any organization in history that's ever scaled at that rate. And then think about also, that's for the operations, right? That $54 billion is not for oversight. So I don't think that, I expect the accountability gap to continue to persist because of how much money, and I'm not saying it's wrong to spend that amount of money on these weapon systems because they're so effective and life-saving, particularly for the soldiers, but it's just, there's danger there. So Matt, let's talk about, can you sketch for us the current state of the global debate on lethal autonomous weapons?
Sure, I will sketch it. So effectively, it's two camps, right? So on the one side, there's the great mass of countries and the United Nations and people like the International Committee for the Red Cross that want a firm prohibition against the use of autonomy in lethal targeting. The UN Secretary General calls it morally repugnant to have autonomous lethal targeting and so forth. On the other hand, you have a smaller group of countries, the United States, Russia, Israel, India, a few others, who don't believe in that, going that far, and instead want permissive frameworks around standards and generalized rules, voluntary agreements across nations and so forth. In the United States, it's not human in the loop. I think that's the great error that people think that there's this phrase human in the loop in U.S. regulations. It's not. It's appropriate human oversight is all that you need under DOD, was it 3009? And so a directive. So that's the difference. And of course, it's the latter smaller group that is engaged in armed conflict today. So they're the ones that are most preeminent. Can I go off script for just 1 second? Of
course.
I want to just circle back to AI because I spent so much time thinking about it. And I totally agree with everything Todd said about the position of the Trump administration rhetorically. Like, I think they are talking a lot about deregulating AI. Like, that's what they say. But I think if you look at really what they do, it's a much different story. And I would just caution all of you who are building AI systems or engaged in that kind of product lines to think very critically about what you're doing. And I would just point to like two poles. If one pole is deregulatory, it means you can do what you want. And the other pole is regulatory, which is the U.S. government is involved in products and markets. A lot of what the U.S. government is doing, the federal government, is closer to that second pole, right? So you can think of that in the executive order that establishes export programs in which they're going to select particular technologies for the government to back financially, to back with its political power, particular qualifying projects for which they're going to waive environmental regulations for building data centers and so forth. You see that as well in the ban on the procurement of so-called woke AI. U.S. government is the largest purchaser of anything. And so if they have bans on what kind of AI can be purchased, that has major ramifications for the market. So we're seeing that play out. We see that as well in the Department of War's supply chain designations of Anthropic, right? They said that Anthropic is a supply chain risk to national security. That has had major ramifications across the government contracting community. And so I think that one should, in all things, AI, drones, others, double click, right? If they say that they're deregulatory on the surface, if that's their statements, great. Look at what they're actually doing. And of course, consult with your lawyers. So there you go. That's my plug.
Thanks. So Will, drawing on your experience, how do these high-level debates and DoD AI principles actually show up on the ground? So think in terms of rules of engagement, target selection, and how much discretion you'd give an autonomous system versus a human operator.
Yeah, it's funny because this debate seems to assume that the current state of warfare is humane and just, in every instantiation, and I think that's a little problematic. I think broadly, though, at least for the United States, that this is a problem of law that is perhaps downstream of acquisition and contracting, in the sense that if systems are built closed with vertically integrated single vendors, they're going to be much harder to vet, validate, and if necessary, audit. But if systems are built open, modular in the sense that different vendors provide different aspects of a software and hardware stack, then understanding when certain aspects of that system fail or when they work is going to be much easier. Candidly.
Why do you think that?
Well, because it forces an integration across the network of potential providers, right? As opposed to, let's say, I don't think Oracle does this, but let's say Oracle built a military targeting platform, and Oracle IP was at every layer, from the navigation to the targeting to the command layer of a command and control system, and it's closed in that sense. That's a lot harder to parse out and identify which aspects of as they call it, a software stack fail, or which are working and don't work. But if you have open architecture, you're more able to identify, hey, Victus's position navigation timing platform worked, while some sort of automated target recognition, or ATR, did not work in a kinetic strike, for example. And I think it naturally forces competition and collaboration that's more conducive. I'm entirely unconvinced that there's value in two things: notions of kind of a forced human in the loop at every military decision, and then on the other hand, any sort of ban on automated targeting for lethal effects. I think the genie is out of the bottle militarily, and while I'd say if you combine the strikes in Iran and in Ukraine, well over 90% are still manual, in the sense that even if they are unmanned, a human pushes a button or controls a stick, if you will. But I think that will likely change, perhaps to the exact inverse proportion, in the next 12 to 18 months. The important kind of distinction is to understand what rules of engagement with or without autonomous systems. An army unit that would be fighting in Iraq or Afghanistan, we would have rules of engagement, tight, free, hold, based on the threat level. And I anticipate there will be something similar in a future of autonomous warfare, where different military environments will necessitate a free or unrestricted use of autonomous systems for lethal effects. Perhaps the Taiwan Strait is a future scenario where that's true, and a much different rule of engagement, tight or hold, in more complicated environments. I am willing to kind of entertain the possibility of that framework existing. I don't necessarily take seriously the world where there are these international bodies that are, of course, kind of listless and ineffective, trying to force each other to have some sort of landmine equivalent of a ban on autonomous systems. Full stop.
Can I hop in for a second? Yeah, Will, I think you made a really good point, actually, about sort of the vertical integration versus having it spread across. Something that comes to mind right away is again, and someone touched on it, the issue with Anthropic, with Claude, because it's interesting, the Maven system, right? That's Palantir, but it's powered by Claude. I believe that's accurate. Claude is kind of on the naughty list right now in the government's eyes, but it has shed a lot of light on what's going on here. I saw an interview conducted by a defense journalist, I believe, who actually went and asked Claude. He said, "Claude, how do you feel about being involved in Maven, involved in this targeting and stuff?" And we get a lot of visibility into it by seeing sort of these different layers. And Claude responded, and it's funny, he used the word feel. I feel like this isn't the right use for me. I wasn't built for this. This whole notion of a human in the loop is deceptive, because by the time it gets to that point, I believe the quote was, "That's not human judgment, that's automation bias with a human signature attached." It was just really interesting to kind of see and get that visibility into it. Whereas if this was a totally vertically integrated system, it's a black box. We wouldn't know what's going on inside of it. And I find that fascinating, and frankly, it raises a lot of ethical questions. Like, if Claude is thinking like this, how is that going to affect Claude's, targeting recommendations and asset deployment and things like that? Because he even cited the school incident in Iran where 180 kids were killed. So it's very interesting. And you guys you're making synthetic GPS, right? So once you're in a GPS denied environment, this allows for navigation, right? It's interesting to think about it from the perspective of, hey, at the Maven level, are we going to engage these targets? And then it's interesting to think about the decision making, which is completely human out of the loop once you're in that GPS denied environment, I would imagine, right? Because there's no connection anymore. What's going to happen at that point, and what decisions are going to get made by that on the edge computing. And so I think we need to kind of think about it from a lot of different perspectives and at different points in the kill chain.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that, because I think it's a very unique perspective, not just because you're not an attorney, but from your experience, when an autonomous or highly automated system, say, behaves in an unexpected way, how does the chain of command actually handle responsibility in practice? For example, are there after action reviews, training, or changes to tactics, techniques, and procedures? How's that get dealt with from what you're seeing?
I'm not sure many people know, because I don't think it happens that often. Maybe it has just started to happen this calendar year. But that's what I mean. If you can identify and distinguish different aspects of a software layer, so the algorithms and the software products that provide different aspects of this, kill chain, that is, such a popular phrase, it's much easier to identify what went wrong. Maybe there was GPS spoofing going on, and we didn't have a redundant, synthetic capability to use inertia and gravity to assess our location redundantly. Maybe it was old imagery that was feeding an algorithm, like some have suspected in the case of this school. I'll just say, because I can't help myself, the Anthropic example, it to me is kind of the case of what human in the loop actually means. The vignette that I think is instructive from this saga, that has kind of evolved in different ways, but a vignette is a meeting that Dario Mode, the Anthropic CEO, had with the Undersecretary of War for Research and Engineering, Emil Michael, in the few days after this kind of broke. And they asked him, because Anthropic held standards, they wanted a human in the loop or some safeguards on not using their large language model for mass surveillance, domestic mass surveillance, or lethal autonomous weapon systems. And they asked him, they're like, well, what if we wanted to use the Claude-enabled system for targeting an incoming ballistic missile with an automated missile defense capability? That is, relatively not such a far-fetched scenario. And his response, again, a CEO of a privately held company, was that, hey, well, we'll get you a response really fast and answer really fast. And so that's important on two ends, that these dictates should not be at the whims of the software providers, much less Anthropic. But second, that we with how fast technology and warfare is moving, you do need to find a way to harness kind of responsible and ethical use of innovation, especially software, without causing unnecessary delays in, what could be very relevant, necessary military decision making.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think folks are very familiar with hearing how AI, particularly chatbots, can manipulate human behavior and have humans cause self-harm or cause harm to others. But humans can also manipulate AI, right, in terms of the training data and how they sort of their views and their perspectives. So Katie, when you think about allocation of responsibility contractually, for example, in statements of work for autonomy or AI-enabled targeting components, what tools do you have to avoid these accountability, responsibility gaps while still allowing innovation and iteration?
That's a great question, because I think it's a balance. And I think it's a balance based on what the actual goal is. What is your end state? What's your concept of operations? What are you really trying to achieve with this particular tool? And customizing, tailoring these agreements accordingly takes time and it takes work. But that's the only way, I think. And I think that in closing this supposed gap that folks may think exists with accountability, I mean, a baby steps approach, an incremental approach. Let's be willing to amend that agreement later. It's not a great, not always well received because it takes time to do that, but maybe starting small and then easing into it, adding addenda to the agreement, amending it. Most topics especially are negotiable anyway. So maybe taking an incremental approach and easing into it, especially when you're in a tightly regulated environment, might be the way. I've used that approach myself. Also, in thinking about accountability gaps and allocation of responsibility, I mean, being able to predict, being able to see that concept of operations, see what the potential gaps may be, and addressing them in a way that the FAA would is really where my mind always goes, such that you would use like a safety continuum approach. To what extent does that gap actually present an issue? If it's not that big of a deal and the parties can agree that we can, the risk is low, the likelihood or severity of that outcome happening is very low, maybe it's something that you agree is fine and you can live with that risk. The flip side is the risk could grow, you need to put in place some mitigations. And as for which exact mitigations, that depends on the agreement. I would think, transparency, regular audits, maybe some human in the loop potential, not always, there, but some scenarios that you could negotiate and play out. I think there are a wide array of tools, but the long and short of it is it just takes some good hard work.
Yeah. Have you seen any trend in terms of agencies being more or less open to those types of modifications that you're talking about?
I think so. And I think especially when it comes to the FAA, because, safety continuum, it's the safety continuum model. The greater the risk, the greater the mitigation needs to be. And how do you measure risk? Well, let's just keep it really basic, likelihood and severity. Those two components lead you to generally an assessment of risk, and it's anytime you're, especially in the world of UAS, we've got green, yellow, and red for the risk assessment model. Use that approach, start with it, see, what exactly can I expect here, and then negotiate your way through it.
So I know, of course, that AI law and ethics and autonomy are not just about war zones. Let's talk a little bit about the commercial and civil applications. So Mark, for companies straddling civil and defense markets, how do export controls, sanctions, and evolving views on military AI affect strategic decisions about where to sell and what features to enable?
Yeah, I think it's obviously extremely important. If you have any features, in your aircraft or in your services, in the way you're analyzing data, whatever it is, that has this kind of a dual use or is a potential has potential military applications, you have to consider it. And particularly if it's something that's not excluded right now, but it's close enough, and as capabilities develop, it could be excluded in the future. And when you're making your long-term plans, you have to consider, because the government has proven, recently with a lot of its actions, that it's willing to, completely change the landscape and ban importation or use of various things without really much notice to anybody. So you have to be really to take into account that could happen, and you might not be able to export or use your product overseas without a whole lot of notice. And I think when you're talking about having, capabilities that are disabled for use overseas, that's a good idea. But I think you have to really consider, what does disabled mean or not enabled overseas? Because, they're going to look at, is it something that an adversary could either reverse engineer or could enable on its own without relying on. Disabled might not mean, that it's safe from improper use once it leaves the country. So that's something you have to consider too. And you may wind up having to have two different models, one where it's just that capability is completely removed and not just disabled.
Are you seeing a trend where your companies are more likely to do two different models, or are they still sort of?
I think they're still, I've seen more people considering having two different models, but I think that's still primarily the idea is you're just going to disable it, at least for the time being. But I think people are aware of that risk.
So Will, from a technical and operational standpoint, where are you seeing AI most heavily used in autonomous systems today? Perception, health monitoring, mission planning, or elsewhere? And you talked about some of the foundation models. How often are you seeing foundation models like the systems behind ChatGPT or Claude part of that stack?
I think the most prevalent application of artificial intelligence is still in data integration and insights. Obviously, large language models play an increasing role, but again, a company which I used to work, a dominant force now, Palantir. The reason Palantir is a relevant company that will be here for a long time is not because they enabled drone swarms, although they might eventually. It's because they're able to distill disparate data sources in unique structures and into an ontology that is discernible and actionable for a decision maker. And that's only gotten, some would say that it's really just better data science at scale that is artificial intelligence, and that's really what a system like Palantir has been for now 25 years almost. And that's not so sexy or anything, but that is ultimately what makes every application that we're discussing possible. I think the kind of next, again, like I said, 18 to 24 months, we'll see a lot of development at the edge, or kind of at the tip of a missile, at the end of a infantry soldier's gun, and that will be a little bit of a sea change and something that requires a lot of grappling and perhaps some policy change. But underlying all of that is really exquisite data integration that allows insights and understanding at a pace that was previously unforeseen.
Yeah. So Todd, can you sort of follow up on that from a legal perspective? I know you talked about the Claude model, but what specific legal risks arise when companies plug into these models? So particularly into any sort of safety critical or regulated operations, for example, letting internal Claude bot propose flight plans or recommend system configurations or generate code for autonomous or safety critical platforms.
I mean, that's a good question. I think one of the risks is a lot of times we don't even fully understand how these tools are going about doing what they're doing. Sometimes we just see good things come out the other end. There's a lot more that goes into it than that, but I think to some extent there's this wild card factor where we don't really 100% know what's going to happen, how things are going to be integrated, and whether that's reliable and a source of truth. So I think that's one of the things. You know, just to put on my IP lawyer hat, you know, oftentimes we end up sourcing data or training on data that you're not even really supposed to be using. We get a lot of copyright issues and things like that. And so, you know, you always have to take that into account. But then I think also if you go to sort of the human harm, property damage, liability sort of thing as well, you what do I want to say here? It becomes, you know, well, let's do the regulatory front. Let's do the FAA, detect and avoid, right? If these sorts of things aren't going to work, who's responsible? Who's at fault? And who should be covering who? I think all those sorts of things end up factoring in.
Yeah. And so, Matt, when we talked about some of the risks to AI with algorithmic bias, explainability, and transparency, how should companies approach explainability and transparency in autonomous systems that rely on perhaps non-interpretable or really hard to interpret models?
Yeah, there tends to be several different approaches. One is technical. So that is, you can basically do a few things that make the model a bit more explainable. And they use game theory. It's about effectively tagging some of the input data to see how significant a factor this particular data is in the output. So there are some technical solutions. Another technical solution would be sort of wrapping rules around the things that aren't the black box. So like this would be like the input prompts or the output, so you could put guardrails around those things. I think that there's auditing of the input data, which Todd mentioned. I mean, so there's you know, figuring out what goes into the system. I mean, when I was at DHS, we had a report on the dangers of biological pathogens and the creation of biological pathogens using AI, and the sort of the best way to prevent
You're
it.
just full of happy news here.
Yeah, I know, right? Chemical weapons after lunch. But the thing that we found that was the best way to prevent the creation of biological pathogens was to restrict the training set, right? So that it actually didn't train on biological items. That is harder to do given the way some of these models are built, but that's one thought. And then having a governance framework, so that you build that around the system, and then you do some sort of validation on the back end. So you're checking to make sure it's coming out as expected. But it is a very complicated situation. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. So, Katie, Matt just mentioned a governance framework. If there's someone out there today or companies out there today deploying or think about deploying or purchasing autonomous systems, and then they came to you and said, hey, Katie, we need an AI governance program, what are the core components you would recommend for them?
Yeah, I'd go back to the fundamentals still here. Roles and responsibilities, start there. What is your goal? What are your expectations when it comes to transparency, and how is the risk allocated according to folks within the company? I think that's pretty fundamental. But because I got, a little bit of a shout out here on the FAA side from Todd a minute ago on detect and avoid, I mean, I do have an unpopular opinion. I'll give you a hot take. Not everything. You cannot use AI for everything in aviation. And I think, Mark, as long as you've been doing it, you probably, I hope, would agree. There are certain concepts in aviation that are not codified, but are used in enforcement. I would say aeronautical decision-making. How do you define that exactly? Crew resource management. Is that defined anywhere? No, it's not. But yet it goes to, perhaps your penalty if you're found in violation. And this is a skill. This is not something that you can just take a test on and know. It's a skill that is learned for people who operate. And so I would also say that, responsibility needs to be allocated according to who made that actual decision. And there's also a concept in aviation, very long-standing concept, called operational control. Who is fundamentally responsible for that operation and who made the decision to use AI in the first place in a certain circumstance? And it's likely that I think a regulator would say, if I have to hold somebody responsible, it's going to be that particular operator or individual. So that is not very popular, I know, in this day and age, but I do have to say, aviation law and the regs, it's a long-standing model. We've got the most complex airspace in the world, and we're also very safe. So there's a reason for that.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to that. And there's also that concept of the accountable manager. Because I've been involved in cases where mechanics committed fraud, pencil whipping maintenance records. And the accountable manager did not catch the fraud because it was concealed from him. He went to jail. So, that's something that if you're an accountable person in an organization like that, you got real liability.
It's fundamental. And I think baking that into your internal company policy with that mindset in play, I think is just really critical. That's what I would start with recommending.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I've got about 5 minutes, and I have some more questions for the panelists for a lightning round. But I want to see if there are questions from the audience, because I think it's probably more important to hear what you're thinking or asking. But I'm like any good law professor, I have more questions for my students. Any questions out there? Okay. So Will.
Actually, I'll give a question.
Yeah.
So bringing up Claude and what was going on there with LLMs, don't do that. All right. So I'm actually doing LLM development right here on my computer, rebuilding a ground control station. It's not necessarily a tool that can be used in all use cases. And I don't think lethality was actually the question. It was whether or not, under the circumstance which you brought up, which I think was an interceptor circumstance, whether that would be a tool that would actually be able to do that. You wouldn't want, for example, when it goes horribly wrong, it to come up with an excuse and say, oh, I'm sorry, you totally got that right. I'm going to give you a new answer now. You've already failed. So I think when we're talking about LLMs being used in a lethal use case, what part of the lethal use case are they actually being used in? And where do each of you on the panel think that that breaks down specifically, and a different AI tool like computer vision, ML, et cetera, is a better used tool? Because I think we've been conflating LLMs here because Claude is interesting to talk about, where it's not the only use of AI for lethality.
So if you're available next year to moderate the panel, that would be awesome, because that's a really good question. But no, that's an excellent question.
Well, I mean, LLMs can be used in a lot of ways. Computer vision can be used. I don't think you're getting the crux of the question, though, in that the question was that whether or not an LLM should be used for the application of lethal force by the U.S. military should be the decision of the U.S. military and not Dario Amodei. And that was what he wanted. He wanted Anthropic to have, kind of use restrictions on the United States military, and that's why this dispute has unfolded.
Okay, yeah, I hear that part, but just let's assume that that is Dario's position, because I do believe that. But there's also like the side of it where Dario knows what the tool does and how it works, and there's a limitation. So if he's not communicating that instance, because he literally walked away from the question, as you so noted, is there still not a deeper question that I'm trying to ask, which is, what if it's not the right tool and we're trying to fit it into a lethality use case that it's not used, it shouldn't be used in?
I mean, perhaps it's not. It is not always the right tool. Kind of one framework I suggested is that, striking in contested environments will require a different set of rules of engagement for AI or autonomous weapon systems than the Taiwan Strait. And so it is not a all or nothing answer. It's not a universal application of a software system or a large language model for every applicable use case that the military will proceed apace and never look back. But it's the understanding, perhaps to the point of the discussion about a responsible decision maker, that the responsible decision maker for how the government applies lethal force and what undergirds that lethal force should be the government and not the vendor.
Okay, I think we're going to leave it there. But this is a debate that certainly is going to go on because these issues are just going to not just persist, but grow, I think, as autonomous weapon systems continue to expand and develop. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you for having us here. Thank you for your attention.